well after a long period slot racing together, and I was always very pleased when he was here, and I'm also very pleased now. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Wolfgang Warnecke, the Chief Scientist Mobility of Shell, and also as a freelancer. Wolfgang, it's your turn.
Okay, Martin, thank you very much. Thomas, thanks for the introduction here. Great to be here. I think great event, and we know each other for a long time. I think Thomas and me, we met about 20 years ago during the Le Mans projects. I've been heavily involved in motorsport since a long time. And I think for today, try to bring you sort of some perspectives on the one hand, what I'm thinking about the future of motorsport, but secondly also what large companies like in this spot, one of the large energy companies on behalf of Shell, but also what we're doing in motorsport and what's possible. So you see already that personally I'm really passionate about the future of motorsport and sustainability transferred and translated not only into the ecological points, but also in the real future of motorsport. So start with a few sort of statements of Shell on behalf of the large energy companies. I think we are in a tremendous transition in the energy world, but also in the transportation world. And I think it's already clear we need really to move into cleaner energy solutions as we see all day. By the way, when we talk about sustainability and clean energy, I think the world has changed a few months ago because there's a new topic, and that is availability of energy due to the Ukraine crisis. And we do feel this every day. So I think there's another driving factor now that we move to it. So what is then the playing field of motorsport and the future of motorsport in this one? So the key question is motorsport, the real motorsport as of today on the track, does it have a future? Or what will be also then the development of e-sport, the virtual motorsport in parallel? And we truly believe that the real motorsport also will have a future under this heading of sustainability, but it will need to move and to change. And I try to give you sort of a few topics on that one. You see here on behalf of one of the key drivers is for sure the energy resources. What is the fuel, in quote, the fuel for the future for motorsport? And for sure, renewable electricity will be the main source for future energy used to produce the fuels also in motorsport. So what are we doing on behalf of Shell in motorsport? You don't need to read this all, but we are heavily involved in motorsport since several decades. We are really, and I will give you later an update where Shell is heading motorsport. We are working very closely with the industry, mainly the key factory teams, the manufacturer itself, and we truly believe that there's a future also under the new challenges of motorsport, which I will bring you into some perspectives in the next few moments. So if we talk always about, and if you read the headlines of the day, it's always about emissions, emissions, emissions. And frankly speaking, when I came up here, by the way, also I came with an electric vehicle up here, and I'm very passionate about the different drivetrains, the different concepts of engines available. So I'm stand-in definitely for open technology and technology openness. But if we really think about emissions, we need to understand what do we talk about emissions. And there are basically three categories of emissions, which also we need to understand in motorsport what is required and what's necessary. So the first one is always the climate-related emissions, here standing in carbon dioxide, as Thomas mentioned as well, racing for the climate. But the second one is also the local, the air pollution emissions. And especially Germany, for example, other mega cities in the past, in the very recent past, it was sort of the name of the game, not to be allowed with some, in quote, dirty diesels, dirty old-style gasoline engines to drive even anymore into the cities. So we need to understand that there's also a challenge to keep the air clean from pollutants. And last not least, especially in urban environments, it's about noise reductions. And that's a big question mark also. And I know lots of emotions in motorsport especially. Does have to be a fast car also be noisy and a nice sound, or are there other options? I think we can discuss that one later. But again, take it that emissions is not only climate-related emissions, but there are other emissions as well. So the interesting bit is if we talk about carbon dioxide and concentrate on that one, I initiated with some of my team I think it was 10 years ago, a mega study when we have been heavily involved with the Le Mans, the RCCO. And the key question was, what is the key emitter regarding CO2 during a race event like Le Mans 24 hours? And we looked into all the details. That means all the fuel we distributed there for all race cars during the practice events, but also during the race. Then in addition also all the energy required simply and the fuel required simply to operate the race, like the safety cars, the stewards, the entire logistics, the trucks coming from England, Italy, wherever, to Le Mans for the race itself. So that means simply to prepare the race itself. And last not least also then the entire fans. And it was an outcome, it was very interesting, that about 1% of all the CO2 emissions for the entire event have been emitted by the race cars only, racing the 55 cars for 24 hours. About factor 10 was simply to produce and operate the entire race itself, so that with no spectators. And about factor 100 was contributed and emitted by the spectators traveling to Le Mans, being there. So in a sense, you could argue, look, I mean, the 1% of the race cars itself does not matter at all. And you could immediately come into the argument of a major sports event, a rock concert, whatever, that the key question is, and the key outcome is, we do not need to look into the race cars itself, but also about into the entire environment, into the event and the entire organization. So we need to keep this in mind. And that's exactly what we do. We look in terms of sustainability in the motorsport. We go even further. And you see on the bottom, this race operations. That was exactly what I just talked is about, simply having the car being able to race. And you see on the right, the power unit and the fuel is less than 1% of the CO2 emissions. But the logistics, the travel, especially if you think about air travel, which is very CO2 intensive, but also then the CO2 in the factory and the facilities, that all does need to be taken into account if you really talk about sustainable motorsport. So statement number one, please keep in mind, if we talk about sustainable CO2 reducing motorsport, it's not the race cars only, it's the entire race organization around. I swap that one simply to move on. So then we come into the fuels. So what are the fuels options? And here will be now 2 or 3 very technical slides. And apologies on that one, but I think it's open for you to take away this openness we need to have in terms of new technologies. So if we think about CO2 and CO2 reducing and sustainable fuels, we basically have 4 options. The first one is we can use more and better biofuels. Why is a biofuel CO2 reducing? Simply during the growth of the plant, we need ultraviolet light and we need some CO2 from air simply to grow the plant. Then this plant, the biomass, is harvested and converted, produced into a biofuel. And then when this biofuel is emitted, some of the CO2, for sure, during the combustion is again emitted into the atmosphere. But remember that for the growth of the biomass, some CO2 has been assimilated out of the atmosphere. So if we're really able to reduce the total CO2 in a kind of closed loop, and by that one, biofuels, depends on the type of biofuels, can reduce carbon dioxide emissions heavily. So therefore, it's a good and important solution, but it will not solve the world. The second one is using more natural gas, and especially biogas. Natural gas, why is natural gas? I know lots of discussion in the moment about availability due to the recent global events we have. But if you burn natural gas, you reduce about 20% of the CO2 emissions, then run a combustion with crude oil based, that means fossil, gasoline or diesel. So if we would be able immediately to swap into natural gas, methane, CH4, then definitely it's a short-term solution to reduce CO2. The third one is hydrogen, and move into hydrogen very soon, and give you a perspective in the next slide. And last not least, racing or driving with green electrons and using green electrons, meaning green electricity in motorsport as well. So those are the 4 options we do have. This one is a very technical slide, and maybe I need to explain it to you slightly, but this is, I think, a key takeaway for you, what will the future bring and what are the options also in motorsport. So there are 3 pathways for ultimately clean vehicles, whether it's a race car or an on-road car. So we always need to start on the left side with renewable CO2 neutral energy sources. And that can be either, as I explained, biomass, which is CO2 reducing, but will be not completely CO2 neutral, and especially with green electricity, renewable electricity. So then if we start this pathway with green electricity, we have 3 options. The first one, the top one, is we distribute this green electricity through a grid with all the difficulties we have, ideally with some storage, some large batteries to overcome intermittency. And then we charge it to our battery and we store the electricity in the battery, in the vehicle, and we drive fully electric, as Thomas explained, as he's coming here with some of the Audi e-trons or Taycans or whatever. So with that one, then we produce no local tailpipe emissions, for sure, but also we would be ideally completely CO2 free. Second option, and that's this middle option, we use the green electricity and we split water, hydrogen and oxygen into the hydrogen and oxygen. So we make use of the oxygen, but especially we keep the hydrogen. And we use the hydrogen and we distribute it, we refill it into a vehicle stored in a tank. Usually it's a pressurized hydrogen with 300 or 700 bar. And we use the hydrogen then to supply a fuel cell. A fuel cell is an onboard unit which takes the hydrogen and the oxygen from air and is producing onboard electricity. This electricity is then used again for the electric motor and driving us forward. Actually, this one is definitely a very attractive solution. I'm personally able, since about 10 years, to drive pre-production cars on hydrogen, fuel cell hydrogen cars, and it's fantastic because it brings the best of all worlds together, in my view. It's very fast refueling. It's about 1 minute refueling for 100-kilometer drive. And secondly, the entire system is relatively light compared to a very heavy battery, but it's relatively complex, and also we need to build up the hydrogen distribution infrastructure, saying about hydrogen retail stations. In Germany, we have about 100 in the moment, so usually I would have come here also with the hydrogen car. With that one, again, there's no emissions. Actually, you get some very clean water, droplets as emission, and we would be completely CO2 free. And then the last one on the bottom, that is the most famous one in the moment, always discussed, is especially the kind of e-fuels, saying the idea that we produce synthetic fuels which do not produce in total closed loop CO2. And how does that work? And that's on the bottom chart. We first of all need again hydrogen, the green hydrogen, and also we need to collect carbon dioxide. It's possible to collect carbon dioxide from air. In the moment it's a very, very small, but already too high concentration. It's 350 ppm CO2, which means 0.035%. So we try to collect this one. There's a lot of effort to collect it. And we use the carbon dioxide and the hydrogen and use that one, convert it into so-called synthetic gas, the syngas. This syngas will be then in a kind of refinery produced into synthetic hydrocarbons. So it could be a diesel fuel, could be a gasoline. And these fuels would be then distributed again as a liquid through the existing distribution circle, including the retail station, and we could fuel the vehicles damit, even up to a certain extent, conventional existing engines. And that is always meant to say, especially when we talk about sustainable motorsport, always there's this, the call to have more e-fuels. E-fuels have a few disadvantages. One key disadvantage is that the energy efficiency, saying from the use of the electricity to the turning wheel, to the kinetic driving, propelling a vehicle forward, is about only 15%. And with that one, is several factors worse. You need more, by far more energy than, for example, if you would drive electric or use on hydrogen. So that's a key challenge on e-fuels. There are very little production plants in the moment, actually no commercial one, and it's relatively expensive fuel, but it's still the third option for the future. So sorry to have this a very technical explanation, but hopefully take away, there's not only one solution like electric cars, there could be also hydrogen, there could be also e-fuels, and all of them very important for the future in motorsport. So here's an example of FIA, an overview for the next few years on some of the global FIA race years. What are the challenges? And in the moment, up to now, as you all know, we drive all the motorsports on conventional fuels. Some of them already contain CO2 reducing biofuels. And you see here on green what is sort of the future. On Formula E, very clear, they drive again on renewable electricity. They need to sort out how to produce the renewable electricity on the track, which is a challenge. Lots of e-fuels. I think very interesting is World Rallycross, with especially the E-Series. In my view, World Rallycross is especially one of the key destinations where electric racing would make sense. But then think about WEC, the third one here, 24-hour races. That really is a challenge, and I think is most difficult to drive that fully electric. So Le Mans WEC race series is running now with a high content on second generation biofuels, and in future it will move eventually to hydrogen. You see on Formula 1, very important as well, they agreed already for 2026 to run on sustainable, as they call it, liquid fuels, but let's see how CO2 reducing that will be. So you see all this, as some of the examples, all the race series are moving on an evolutionary pathway already to different fuels, simply to reduce emissions. So where is Shell involved? You see here some of the examples. We are always around the world heavily involved in bike racing, was very successful with Ducati, which actually I created some 20 years ago, in Formula 1 with our red friends from Italy, NASCAR, Formula E with several teams, WRC, IndyCar, by the way, racing also on 100% sustainable fuel already. But also we look, as I mentioned earlier, not only into the teams and the cars itself, but also try to help with the entire infrastructure for the race events. One example on what we're doing with Ferrari, as mentioned earlier, we are developing in Hamburg in our technology labs the race fuels and the lubricants for hopefully again winning lots of Formula 1 races, but also we look into the transportation of the fuels. So for example, the trucks we are using as tank wagon are driving already on very cleaner diesel fuels. We call it the R33. It's 33% sustainable diesel fuel. But also we help Ferrari and the team in race operations and in the factory itself, for example, on photovoltaic, on energy reducing, better air conditioning and so on. So it's more than the race cars itself. As mentioned earlier, why are we involved in so many races, in race series? I think it's important, and I stand in, that we need to be for technology openness. And I'm a true believer that the concept of Formula E cannot be applied across all race series, but we need to have different technologies and different forms of energies and different engines for the different race series. So again, short races, stints with a few cars for a few moments only, Definitely, that's for sure a destination for battery electric. If you go to the other extreme, you go into endurance races. I think it's next to impossible, or at least very difficult, to race battery electric versus maybe e-fuels or hydrogen as an option, because simply the weight and the energy stored on board and the refueling, recharging will be by far easier. So let's keep in mind different options for everything. This is sort of the second last chart, and I like to show you back from moving away from motorsport, simply how the world in transportation may split and will be split. You see on the horizontal axis the operational time. You could translate it into kilometers per year we are driving on vehicles. And you see here sort of on the bottom left, a smart car usually driving whatever 3,000–5,000 kilometers a year, commuting at an average speed, and that is a vertical axis. What is the power, the performance you need simply to propel your vehicle forward? This is not the peak performance, the peak horsepower, but you need about 10 PS or kilowatts to propel you forward. So that's the bottom left side. But you see on the top right, these are sort of the ocean-going container vessels with 15,000 container or international flights. This is the other extreme on very high propulsion power required, but also very intensive use. And the bottom left, that means our passenger cars especially, they are relatively easy to convert to fully battery electric, as we see it all on the road. The infrastructure, the charging will be there, it's relatively easy. But the more you move to the very long, high energy intense, high duration vehicles, even on trucks, it's very difficult and challenging to stick to battery electric. And therefore, there may be other solutions, as I mentioned earlier, the so-called e-fuels, biofuels, for example, for flying, but also for the larger vehicles like trucks, tractors, off-road equipment, and so on. There may be also good solutions, for example, for hydrogen. So with that one, different fuels definitely will have a future and will play an important role. But again, that should be my last slide. I hope that we need to consider, unfortunately, since late February, not only talking about sustainability in the sense of carbon dioxide emission reduction, but also we need to ensure that we have sufficient energy available, that we are able simply to keep the heat in our houses, keep the industry operating, but also to refuel, to be able to refuel our car, whether it's with gasoline, diesel, gas, or electricity on the charger. And in the moment, in Central Europe, we are in a very critical stage in terms of energy supply. So let's keep fingers crossed that we move into a good future. And I'd like to thank you so far. And I think it's back to Martin now.
Wolfgang, it's always a huge pleasure to follow you, because you're absolutely well known as a really integral person, first of all. You know your shit, like to say. If I would give you 50 euros now, would you split it into biofuel and electricity, or motorsport, or would you pay a little bit more for biofuel?
I think I'm very much, I live in two worlds. I live privately with old cars and big engines. So, and in professional, I live 10 or 20 years ahead. So some of my colleagues, they always call me Jekyll and Hyde, and they don't understand how I live. So I take the 50 euros and would invest in the future. So definitely I would use it into the best fuel for the future. And it could be electricity, it could be hydrogen, but it highly depends on what to do. So, for example, on Bilsterberg with the race car, you could do only a few laps, and then you need to wait another 20 minutes or so to recharge. If you go for hydrogen, you would be at least most of the time on track. So I would take the 50 euros and convert it into hydrogen.
You just said it in your keynote speech that you're very close to a World Rallycross Championship due to the fact that they started a new era this weekend in Hell in Norway. It's not the Hell, but it's really called Hell, the city over there. Would you say that the engineers who invented the cars for rallycross, especially for rallycross, are the best engineers for motorsport?
Well, that's a
Say
key challenge.
yes, please.
Yeah. Personally, I'm a fan of all sports, like also on the esports, where you have a tight race back to back. So whether it's, I think, in ski racing, in border cross, or in rally cross, I mean, if there are 4 or 5 competitors very close to each other and really for a few minutes only, and if you look into the conventional rallycross cars, I think it's exciting, the peak performance and the gearbox, the drivetrain development over the time. So I think there's a lot of technology involved for this high power output and the high acceleration on this mixed surface. So rallycross is definitely very challenging. Whether it's the most challenging, I don't know, but at least rallycross for me is, frankly speaking, I'm very maybe challenged in challenge statement. I think rallycross for me is the key solution for electric racing, by far better than Formula E for me. Formula E could be duplicated as well with other options, but rallycross definitely, I think, should be the leading race event for electricity in my view.
Ladies and gentlemen, Wolfgang Warnecke, the Chief Scientist Mobility of Shell Racing in Germany. Big applause for Wolfgang Warnecke.
Thank you, Martin.
Thank you, Wolfgang.